Flutter is kind of just Google's answer to React Native in a lot of ways. React Native goes and uses the native UI bridge, where Flutter is just all built on top of its own 2D engine that's baked into the app. And I'll go through it a little bit more about that. But it's a declarative UI that makes it much easier to build a UI than past instances like with XML, HTML. I believe it does, at least. Some people might argue against it. We will get into some code a little later, but I do want to give the pitch of why you'd want to use Flutter and over any other framework right now for mobile development and now web development, as they've just entered beta with their web development. So, and you can read it right here, or you can bring it up. I mean, if you haven't already, it gives you a little bit more explanation of what Flutter is. It is open sourced. It is built by Google. They have a huge team on it. No, it's not going to probably end up like Angular, where Angular went to Angular 2 and had a huge delay. This is run very well. They come out with new versions all the time, so I don't think there's any issue. It's going to crop up with Flutter and its development time. So it runs everywhere. Pretty much right now, there's probably a flavor of Flutter somewhere. Whether or not, in fact, I built a little bit of a Internet of Things app for Raspberry Pi. You can find some repos that actually have starter code for that too. And so it runs pretty well in Raspberry Pi at about 60 frames per second. And so it is amazing, like just how fast it is, but and how beautiful. That's the thing that actually caught me with Flutter was how easy it was to make a very beautiful app, where I've come from the Ionic world. And in HTML and CSS, you can make some really good stuff, but I really am not the biggest fan of the rendering engine of some of the browsers rendering HTML. It's just it just doesn't look quite as crisp as a mobile app when you do a web view. And so, but for most applications, Ionic works great. You're able to build a website and a mobile app at the same time. And at the same time, you're able to use Node on the back end. So it's the best of all the worlds of just getting to use JavaScript to, and that's it. You don't have to learn any other languages, and that can usually improve development time. And usually if you have to deal with one language, I think it also reduces bugs, in my opinion, too. But yeah, so it has a beautiful experience, user experience, beautiful UI. It's really easy to use right off the bat. But the one question that I always get, and this is very common that I've had when talking to other people, or when I get clients and stuff like that, and I've talked them into Ionic, and that's speed. So Ionic's gotten a lot faster. Cordova's gotten a lot faster over the years. And so I'm able to convince clients in the past to use Ionic. And to be honest, Ionic's great for most applications. But there's always comes to a point where you build such a big app and certain pieces need to be added to it that you really just have to start optimizing your Ionic. And that's kind of changing more and more. Like it's starting to come down to really what is a better just framework and tightly written together. And I think Cordova's kind of fallen apart at this point. And I can talk about that a little bit later, but I definitely wouldn't recommend jumping into a Cordova app at this point, because multiple plugins are just not working very well anymore. The reason why it's so fast is because it essentially compiles to machine code that runs on the device. And so it is arguably as fast as native. So if you're using the standard iOS or Android's SDKs or their systems, they're going to be like the most optimal, the fastest. But Flutter can get pretty dang close, and because the way it compiles to machine code, it could be optimized in theory to be faster. In theory, it just all depends. You know, that all comes down to optimizing, and that's a whole other can of worms. But one of the biggest reasons it is so fast, it's not a web view, and it's not a UI layer. Where with React Native, that UI layer makes it really fast on the UI side. But when it comes to, if you have to execute a lot of JavaScript, then your React Native app is going to start bogging down quite a bit. And with Flutter, I've just never gotten that. And I've written a multiple apps now where it's just, it really is, it just feels like it's native in every way. So, and it's built with Skia, and that's what Android actually uses, I believe, for their visual library. That if you're building an Android app, it's going to be written on top of Skia. I believe it's also what is in Chrome. That it's the rendering engine for Chrome, and with it, they're able to target 60 frames per second everywhere, and they're able to embed it everywhere because Skia actually is implemented, and it can be used. The 2D engine can be used on every platform. You can look at it on Wikipedia. It'll show you like how robust it is, and so it's pretty awesome that it's written in Skia, and it really shows like every aspect of this is just fast, and I find that very important. And I actually never put it in the slides, but I think the next really important thing is the plugins. I'll go over some plugins, but the plugins are just great. They have to bridge it. It's kind of like Cordova and React Native. Plugins are usually bridges between like dark code and the native code or interface. And the plugins are just great. They always work. Like contacts, if you're trying to bring in phone contacts on an Ionic app with Cordova, it will lock up if the person has over 100, and it can take up to 30 seconds. This is one of the issues I had to overcome with my client. And with Dart, it's literally it's probably like 400 milliseconds to get those contacts. So
you keep on mentioning Cordova, and I think with this audience, many of them may not know what that is. I could be mistaken.
Yeah. That's a good question. That's hard. I'm like, I need like a poll or something to see what people know. So Cordova is essentially a web mobile framework. So you can take HTML, JavaScript, and CSS and build mobile applications with it, and you're able to build the application into an APK or an IPA, which is what native devices like your phone runs on. And so you can submit it to those app stores and you have a full functioning app. Cordova is that like, it's the base for Ionic and a lot of other web to mobile frameworks. And a big part of it is plugins, is that it handles plugins. It handles the interface between, if you want, let's say if you want to get contacts, like the example I had earlier, if you want to get contacts from your phone and then like display them or send them to it's a little sketchy when you just try to send it to your server without permissions, but you can get those contacts through that bridge. And so Cordova was the de facto. Ionic is built on top of Cordova and implements a whole UI layer where it has components for Material and IO, and I can't remember if they have Cupertino, but they do have Material was their base, and then they had whatever the old design system that iOS had. And so if you were running the device on iOS, it looked like an iOS app. If you were on the device on Android, it looked like an Android app. And that's actually a big part of the problem I also had with Ionic, is that it just wasn't customizable. Yeah, so that's essentially what Cordova is. It just makes it so that you can write apps for mobile. Does that answer that enough?
Yeah, does anybody else have a question on that?
Well, so in that case, one of the key things to understand, this is a way of restating, I think, what you said, James, is like Cordova and its plugins are providing your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with APIs to interact with the native capabilities of the phone. Whereas what you're talking about here, it's going to be built directly into the, as you compile things down. So instead of running JavaScript inside JavaScript core, interfacing with APIs that are made available to JavaScript to the web view, you're literally running in a native component that has access to the native capabilities through the API.
Yes, to a point, but they still has to have some type of bridge to map the APIs from the native into your app. There still needs to be some bridge because it is a multi-platform language. You have to have that bridge in there to just map those APIs. But yeah, it's essentially does compile down into machine code, and you have a lot less issues than if you had with JavaScript. I'm not trying to get too complicated on this, but it is a little like this part of it is really complicated. Maybe I shouldn't have gone too deep into it.
Well, I'm always tempted to go deep into this one because I, 7 years ago was doing a mobile application development company, and we were using Cordova competitor. And one of the most difficult performance problems we had was transferring stuff across that boundary between the web view and the native code, because you have to essentially stringify it. You have to serialize it and deserialize it, and every time you do, you've got to spend the time and energy to do it.
Yep. Then, I haven't written a plugin in Flutter, so I don't know exactly what that entails. So I couldn't actually tell you if it improves or not. All I know is using the plugins, they're the fastest I've ever seen an interface between a framework and a device, in my experience.
Well, and I would imagine it's easy. In some ways, it's easier to create something new than to constantly maintain and update something that's old. And I mean, the iPhone just never had good APIs, and still the APIs are meh. But they're a million times better than what they were back in when PhoneGap/Cordova was king of the hill. Like, they were terrible back then.
Yeah, PhoneGap. I followed PhoneGap for a long time, and in fact, Facebook's mobile app was written on PhoneGap way back, and then they dropped it because just the speed. Yeah, no, PhoneGap to Cordova. It's just it has a toxic community, somewhat. Like, I went to one of the contributors, like main contributors, meetings at like Open West a couple years ago, and they're a little more toxic, and I could see why it's kind of fallen apart a little bit. And it's not to say anything bad. It's just. Cordova, if you really get into the community, I don't think Cordova is going to last for too much longer, but we'll see. And Ionic even sees that. That's why they're building Capacitor, which makes it a little bit, you can use Cordova plugins with it, but they also have their own written plugins. And Capacitor is the guys from Ionic. They wrote this whole replacement for Cordova, and it actually is better. So if you do go down the route of Ionic or going down the route of wanting to build a web mobile app, then I definitely recommend Capacitor.js over Cordova. So, you probably already read this page already, but it's actually really easy to jump into. I've written many applications in many different programming languages over my 10 years. Of experience, but I found that it was pretty easy, and it'd probably be even easier for someone new to get into Flutter than if you get really used to JavaScript or TypeScript and not having that type system really embedded in there. Because once again, it is actually, like, for the most part, flexible. Dart, and I'll get into it. Dart does allow for dynamic variables. And vars and final and stuff like that. So you don't have to do set your types, but it's still recommended too. So, so Dart, yeah, it's kind of multi-threaded on the back end. From my understanding, People have made it so that it is. I don't know exactly how the multi-threaded works on the back end, but that's, I think, what is a plus, is that you can run. You're supposed to be able to run multiple threads with Dart on the back end, and it is. Dart is just supported everywhere right now. It's the kind of the design is of Dart was it can transpile into JavaScript, but you can also compile into a bunch of different platforms that will run just fine. And that's what makes it so powerful, is that it's designed from the ground up to transpile and to compile into other platforms that can run the code. And so it makes it really good at being a chameleon and blending into its environment where it needs to go. But yeah, the thing about Flutter though so far is that I'm able to go from an idea to like launching it fast. That is, for me, when I'm looking at technologies, how fast can I go from the idea that I have to final product? And that's the most important thing when I look. And that's one of the things I liked about Node, is that I think you can get things going really fast. I was a big Meteor fan, even though there were some initial issues, and they're kind of getting back into things. Meteor I really liked because you're able to get from an idea to launch. And that's when you're in the startup world, because I've been in the startup world a lot. That's the most important thing. You can refactor into a more robust system later on, but launching a good app is better than launching a great app late. And so I'm not going to compare the frameworks too much because we don't have a whole lot of time, but you can go through here and you can see some of the pluses, because I have a bunch of different slides on it. But I will note right here, so you can see, and GitHub stars isn't like, doesn't necessarily mean the best thing, but it does give you a sign of like popularity. And these are numbers I took from almost a month ago, but it is beating React Native. Flutter is already past React Native and GitHub stars, which I find is just amazing, because Flutter hit version 1 about a year ago. And so where React Native really hasn't hit version 1 yet, but they've been in production apps for what, 4 years, 5 years. Instagram, I believe, is built on it. Airbnb might have stopped using it. I can't remember. There's a bunch of mainstream apps that are built with React Native, and it is a good option. But even when I've had to do it for some clients I've had in the past, it's been an okay option from my side, because I had so many issues. And if you ever upgrade from one version to another, so many breaking changes can happen in that. It's just nuts. Where I've been following Flutter now for actually about 8 months. It'll be a year, yeah, about 8 months. And I have gone through a couple of version upgrades, and I really haven't run into any issues yet. They do a pretty good job of supporting, not doing any breaking changes between just their just regular version updates. They don't do any major version updates really, but going from like 1 point, I can't remember what the last major update was, but just going from just one version update, no breaking changes. And you guys can look into the, like, I gave you the URL. You can look into this further on like the comparisons between the different frameworks. And so we're not going to write code quite. Yeah, let's write some code. I'm going to show you how easy it is to actually just get using the. And I don't normally do live demos, so, and I didn't do it last time, so wish me luck.
There was one thing that I think we talked about before we actually started the presentation. I just wanted to reiterate on a little bit.
Yeah.
So Dart is Google, back before TypeScript was TypeScript, back when it was AtScript, Google was developing both AtScript and Dart at the same time. And like the Node community latched on to AtScript, then became TypeScript, but then this Dart community evolved out of what basically was Google's attempt of JavaScript 2.0. And so this Dart's like very, very similar to JavaScript in the way that it looks and feels, right?
In a lot of ways, but you're going to find it has more similarities to something like Java or C# in a lot of ways. But you'll see it's not verbose like those languages. Luckily, it's much more pleasant. It's a much newer language. But yeah, no, you're gonna feel a little bit at home when you get into Dart, as opposed to if you're getting into something like Java from JavaScript. And so yeah, it's gonna be similar. And it's definitely a language I recommend getting into if you want to learn another language and coming from JavaScript. Instead of like Python and JavaScript are very different languages and how they're written and how they execute. Where Dart and Dart can compile into JavaScript, and so, or transpile. So, any other questions before I continue? You can even speak up at this point. I think there's not enough, like there's a small enough people too. Anything needs to be clarified. Okay. Sometimes I can go a little bit too deep. Especially since it's harder to like gauge the audience a little bit more online. So I will say the hardest part of Flutter is actually in the process of getting it on your computer and getting it running in the in your command prompt or your terminal. Once you get past that part, because they don't have an easy installation process, you essentially have to download a zip, unzip it to a location that you want, and then you need to make sure it's applied to your terminal. And I'm not going to go into all of that. And essentially, once you get past that point, it's really easy, and there's a lot of built-in tools with both Android Studio and VS Code, and I use VS Code. So I already have everything set up. It should just create right here. We're going to create a demo. We created a project because I'm on the, if you're either on the Dart's dev or beta channel, which is like just different levels of Dart, meaning they have a stable where that's the stable version of Dart you can program off of. I usually run in dev or beta because it has the web capabilities. Web is capable, like, so if you set up your environment to beta, you will have web capabilities. I only say that because if you're interested in the website of Dart, which is pretty cool, and I'll show you that here in a second, you have to enable beta. And all the instructions, I have a link in the presentation in one of the slides of just the Flutter webpage. If you go to the Flutter webpage, go to the getting started, they have a whole, it's actually a very robust document. Their documentation of their widgets are okay, but their documentation for everything else is amazing. And their documentation for the widgets is good. It's more scientific though, where it doesn't give you a lot of good examples. It just goes into like properties and what each class kind of does. So, okay, so if we open up the Flutter demo in code, you'll get a couple of folders. You're going to get the lib folder, which is where you work out of. And this is indicative of just, this is Dart, period. So if you're doing just a plain Dart or a backend, when you create a new app, it usually starts in the lib. That was one thing that kind of threw me off a little bit, but you're also, by going the route of doing Flutter create, you start out with this just main application. It's reminds me a little bit of C or C++, where you have this main function, and this is what executes everything. So you have to have this in your main.dart. And so if you're executing, and this needs to, Flutter will automatically execute this. It will look for this and execute it, but you have to have this in it. If you don't have this, your app will not run. So if we go ahead and let's run it on Chrome first. And I just want to show you, because this gives you a good setup of like what it's going to look like before I even change anything. And what I'm doing right here, this is VS Code, and maybe I need to like zoom in a little bit, and I never remember how to do it on my, because I'm sure you can't see it very well. I'll get into that in a second. So you can see that this is running. This is actually, the UI is compiled out into HTML and CSS and JavaScript kind of and JavaScript, yeah. And so, yeah, no, this UI right here that you see is web. But if we go down here and switch, and this is all built in. So once you have Flutter installed on your device or on your computer, and you have, it's been a while since I've installed it, but if you have the Flutter plugin for VS Code, then it just gives you all these tooling, and it shows you like what version of Dart you're on, which is important. JavaScript, you're not gonna, like, it wasn't as important in JavaScript to know what versions you're on, but there's so many new features coming out that it's good to know what version of Dart you're on. But you can go over here and select what device it outputs to. In this case, I'm gonna say the iPhone 8, but I don't know exactly what that is. So okay, so if we choose the iPhone 8, and then if we, it's function F5, if you do hit F5, I believe it's F5 on either Windows or Mac, you can actually get it to start building. I'll go through some of the code real quick. So with the main app, you need to have this material app. This is the wrapper. This says that this app is a material app. You can also do a Cupertino. They have that, or you can just do your own custom. They give you so many tools and widgets that you could essentially create your own design language. But I would never see I'd never see a reason why you wouldn't want to at least have the base of Cupertino or material and then create your own design language from there. And that's actually my recommendation. I would never recommend just starting from scratch unless you're just curious. But I definitely also wouldn't recommend just making it look as plain material. That's starting to become the new Bootstrap, where material looks great, but you can tell if you don't customize enough that it's just a material app. With that, it has the title, and that's the title of the running app, and that's not going to matter much. Themes, so you can actually change different parts of the components from here, how they're going to look. You can change it from your theme data. That gets passed in, and then this is the home. This is the little widget. So everything's a widget within a widget. And widgets are essentially like components where they hold, and they're almost always component-based widgets, but they also have functional and some other types of widgets. Like you can see here, like this theme data widget, this isn't really visual. It doesn't actually render anything. It just sets variables. Where with home, if you pass a home widget that actually has a rendering method, which is called build down here. So you can see this home right here. This is a home class. So there's two classes, and Dart is very class oriented. It's very object oriented. You can get some type of plugins that will make it so you can build your do more functional based. But it does transpiling in the background. So when it goes to build, it actually transpiles your function into a class. But then it will look more like, if you're used to React, it will look more like React if you want that with that type of plugin. I'm not going to tell you what it is. If you're curious, you can ask me later if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But my recommendation, if you're going to be starting out with Flutter, is to start out as simple as possible and then add pieces in. And the base that they have here is actually pretty good. They have routing too, so you can add routes. They also have a couple must-have plugins I'll mention later. That's definitely worth having. So you can see in this class right here, it's a stateful widget, meaning I can change the state inside this widget, where there's two types of widgets, stateless and stateful. If it was stateless, I can't change the state in this. The state has to be changed from outside. Whatever's getting passed into that component can re-render this component, but inside the component, you have no way of re-rendering the component. And the point of that is for speed. It makes it so that it's one-way bound. It makes it so you not re-rendering widgets that don't need to be re-rendered, and that's how one of the ways they're able to make it so fast. And that's one of the things that like React kind of introduced, I think, way back in the day. But you have to have this build, and it's an override method. It gets overridden, this build. And this is where you actually add all your widgets that build out the UI. So if we want to look at this, so this is it. This is built out on the iOS device now. See, looks pretty similar, right? Functions the same. The difference is that this gets centered. If it's web, it gets centered to the left. iOS gets centered in the middle if you're with the scaffolding. And this just comes from scaffolding. And this is an example that you can make really easy on your own by just following what I did with the Flutter create dot to also get this and play around with it. I definitely recommend playing around with it as much as possible, Flutter, when you're first starting into it, because it does have that, I think it does have a little bit of learning curve if you're not used to this type of development, just using tons of widgets or components. But yeah, the scaffold is just essentially, it makes this, in fact, let's make this a little bit. Can you guys read the code okay? I probably should have really been more mindful and started the this whole thing with a little bit. I just never remember how to zoom in. Is that okay? I'm not going to continue until.
It's fine for me, and I'm not on a Retina display right now.
Okay.
Others say it looks good.
Okay. Okay. So with the scaffold is indicative. It just means this whole white page. So if we disabled scaffold, it looks really weird. So in fact, I'll do that real quick. It's all hot reloaded too, and so if I remove scaffold, I have to get rid of this floating button. And potentially this. So now we don't have the scaffold in there. You can see that it doesn't have the page field of a mobile app. You can always create your own widget, like with a container or something like that, and just build out if you want the page to look really different. But scaffold also has Cupertino scaffold too, to where we'll set it up and really function more like a iOS page. Inside of a scaffold, you have an app bar that you can set or you can not set. You can see disable it. It's disabled up the top. You can add an action button. So let's see, like flat. Let's do a flat button. It has to have a child, and that's another thing. Most widgets require a child, and that's just how cascading declarative UI works. It's just you have widgets within widgets until you get the content, like with this text widget, where I can just say, "Hey," inside this flat button, and it will show a little button, and it's grayed out because there's no handler for its event, any of its events. But if we do an on tap, let's see, no, on this one it is. Oh, that's another thing I love about Unpressed. I love about Flutter development is that their docs and it's so ingrained that if I wanted to go in and see what scaffold it really has, I just command. If you're on the Mac, you just hold down your command button and click into it, and you can see all the. In fact, you can even, it will show you like what it looks like. That's how robust their code is with VS Code. Is that you can. Their docs are amazing. If you want to see examples of being used, you can actually go into the scaffold code and see what they've written about it. You can see sometimes they have little issues where they're like, if you're running into some type of issue with this component, we know of these types of known issues that are kind of quirks, or how to use it. It's really, I don't have to look up the documentation very often. That's how nice their documentation is built in to VS Code. And so you can see these are all the different parameters we can add to customize a scaffold. Bottom, like drawers, which goes off, which is I think the bottom drawer. They also have they just, I'm not going to go into every single piece, but they have the floating action button down here. That's also built into the scaffold. So if you want that, you can also reorient it in other places in the scaffold. But yeah, and then we can also, you can I'll just say null for now, but then you can see it, it highlights now. You can click down, it's a material button. And they have multiple buttons. They have icon buttons. They have the fab button right here that they have, floating action button. There's a bunch of different buttons, and you can always customize them and make them your own. If you want to change, so they also have the center. That's one of the things I hate about HTML, right? Is centering a page, and it's gotten so much better now. But if you were in HTML and CSS, like back in the day, like, you know, back when I started, centering divs and centering elements on a screen was just difficult. In Flutter, it's just dead simple. It's really as easy as using center if you want it to be absolutely centered. That's what centering this right here. Just makes it absolutely centered. Or you can use columns and rows, and they also have, like, see this main axis. So this is a column right here. It essentially, yeah, it paints it from top to bottom, and then also you can change the direction, so it can paint it from bottom to top. It does the what is it called in CSS? It's not the grid layout, it's the dang, can't remember what it's called, but it essentially does the layouts of start, center, end, and you can also do in between and do a lot of
Flexbox.
Yes, Flexbox. I don't know why I couldn't remember that, but yeah, it does the Flexbox style, and which is very, very useful for mobile development. If you need to get more into customized grid, they do have a grid component. I haven't messed with it much. I haven't done actually a lot of web component or web development with Flutter yet. The only time I've done web development is to create admins to support the apps I build. So, yeah, I mean, you also have styles right here. If I want to do a custom style instead of this style right here is coming in from the theme. I can create a custom one, and you can also hover over to see what style or what type it is. So it says text style. So we know that we need the text style class, and then we can change the color right here, and we can change it to, they have a bunch of built-in colors that you can go in and use, or you can also create your own. So we shrink that, change the color. We can also add another piece to this. Like they have a list. This is one I use a lot, is the list tile, which can take in a title or subtitle. Let's do this. So it creates this little list item. You can't see it very well, but this is just it's very useful for lists. And then you can create subtitle. And then we can do, let's do an icon. And these icons are also really easy to use inside of Flutter. And you can, it usually comes standard also with the iOS set too, but then you can also use Font Awesome. There's a lot of plugins that just give you a ton of icons, which can be a double-edged sword because it can also add to your payload, or how much it's going to cost you and people downloading the app or consuming the website. So see, we got this little, it's centered though, because that's the alignment of list tile, but I could go in and say, don't center this, or I could put it inside of a row. And a row can take an array, which means it can take in multiple elements, multiple widgets. And so you can also do an on pressed, or I think in this one it's on tapped. I don't know why the difference between on pressed and on tap. Well, I do know the on press means it does work really well with web. On tap, I think it still works with it, but I haven't tested that yet. So you can still add that, and it makes it so it's also you can click this. And so so you kind of, you've seen some of the code. I haven't been able to like show you too much with the time that I have, but this is there's just so much to play with. And I have a couple of links that will help you get started even more with playing with all these components and seeing what components are available. One of the ones I really like is, let's see if I can get my browser with a million tabs. Really, this is one of my favorite websites with finding out like what, because I still don't know every single widget inside of Flutter. I haven't used every single one. I have to sometimes go through and see all the different widgets that they have. And that's one of the pluses I think that Flutter also has over React Native, is that if you want anything that's semi-customized, it's usually a plugin. And once it becomes a plugin, it's this third party and it's not supported by the main developers. And you get that, from my understanding, that's one of the biggest issues with React Native, is just plugin. Once you have someone else write functionality for the framework or platform, then you introduce a weak link into your whole application, and the less that you can do that, the better your application's going to survive over multiple years. But yeah, you can see like the Cupertino right here. You can get a Cupertino switch, and this is one of those cool ones where if you actually do I can't remember what it's called. I think it's like switch dot adaptive. If you do some components have adaptive, and they'll show the right widget depending on if you're on iOS or Android. And so that's all you have to do, is do dot adaptive. And so data tables, so you can see like all the different widgets, and they don't give you every example, but if they give you an example of the code, this is the best. This is the way I learn. This is the way I like documentations. This is not their official docs, but this is how I consume widgets the best. And so, and components when I'm in JavaScript world, is just knowing the list of them and seeing examples of how I should use it. Not very often I have to get over here because everything's fairly built into VS Code, but never hurts to go through here and just see what there is available. So, so this has some more additional examples of code that you can run, and it's called Dartpad. But I'm not going to go. I purposely didn't go into this as much because I wanted to show you what it looked like. And that's one of the mistakes I think I feel like I did last time doing this presentation, is that I just wanted to show you in VS Code like how robust and amazing the experience is writing Flutter in it. I don't have to leave my editor very often when doing Flutter, and I love that. Doing a build is as easy as build Flutter build iOS. It may or may not work. It might take a while, but this essentially just creates this. Well, when you first create it, it creates an iOS folder, but then it builds out everything, and then you can open up. It will create, if it hasn't already, it has. So if you open up your project space for your iOS device inside of, and this is my clients right now. This is it, this is how you would build an app or an IPA for iOS and for the App Store, for the Apple App Store. It would be through here, or you can automate it. There's some additional tools like I believe it's Code Magic, which has a whole automation step that's built into GitHub where when you push to master, they can watch for that, they can build, and then they can actually, I believe, upload it to the app stores. And so that's it's very cool. I haven't gotten to that part yet because I'm not at the end of my client's app. Once I get to the end of it, I am going to add that because I hate going through here and creating a new build every time. But this is what you'd use. If you're doing native iOS, this is what you use. If you're doing Cordova or Ionic or Capacitor, you can build. It's recommended to go through here to do a lot of different things. Capacitor wants you to do more customized settings where you have to say what this app's capable of. Cordova is a little less like that, but yeah, let's see. Oh yeah, I I believe I already hit all this stuff. But then you can get into the tools. And I really like, or these are the sites I actually like, that like Start Flutter. And you can get a lot of cool starter packs, and there's a lot of open source code out there with some really pretty designs. That is just amazing. Like I'm building a fitness app right now, and I'm also doing a game app also. And to just get started with those was so easy with the starters, to then just build it on my own. Supernova allows you to take right here. Supernova allows you to take a sketch file and then export it into Supernova, and then you can actually indicate transitions and button presses and like a couple other pieces like pages and stuff like that, and it exports it into actually decent Flutter code. I've actually went and tried it out myself, and it's kind of cool because then you can get a lot of that. If you're not a UI person, but if you know someone that is, or if you want to get a design from an already existing sketch doc, you can essentially get most of your UI made for free, which might be useful for the Node community, because I'm assuming you guys would want to work on more on the back end kind of thing, but you still might want to do UI, because UI is still really important. Rive is really amazing animation library, and you can make some amazing animations with it for splash screens and just transition effects. CodeMagic is it's free-ish to start out. It's the one that builds out your app automatically, and it has a whole it's a GitHub app too, so it can integrate with your GitHub repo. Adobe Xd also has a feature that's similar to Supernova for exporting UI designs into Flutter code. And some great plugins that I like for, like, if you want to create your launcher icons, if you want to make those icons, because I hate making the icons for mobile. You have to make about 30 different kinds for each device. So that's like 60 icons you have to make. And if you don't, and there's no really good tools to do both. This one will just, you take one icon, put it in, and then it will prepare it all and put it all in place. And so it's really nice. Same thing with screenshots. It has a screenshot device that will go and take screenshots for the app stores. Provider is and I never got into this, but Provider is the state management that I use. And it's a lot like a service that also has, like, if you've ever done Angular, it's a lot like a service in Angular with dependency injection in a lot of ways. So, meaning, yeah, well, Provider is also available in React Native, I believe, too. So where you have a consumer and also the provider, and in the provider you can say, hey, something's changed in here, and then whatever's consuming that then can re-render. And I'm not going to go into that. There's a lot of good examples in there. That's the route I recommend going for state management. Yeah, which is right here, Provider. Block, great. Redux, great. Movex, I mean, these are all great, but Provider and the built-in set state, which I never even got into, because it's a whole ecosystem that it would take a couple hours to just really introduce you guys to. I really just want to show you, like, I just really want to convince people that this is a really good route to go when having to choose a mobile platform, and it's getting even better with the web. And so I probably I'm about there. So a couple of tips, and then I'll just leave it there. Enable your auto formatter inside the IDE. I don't normally do that. I haven't used Prettyfy or Prettier. I think it's Prettier. Let's see, Prettyfy.
Prettier.
Yeah, it's Prettier, and I've never really used it in the past. I mean, I love the concept of it. I use it more now, but I found that my Flutter code was starting to get really weird looking at times, and so I use the auto formatter that VS Code just has for it. You can just go and enable it inside the settings, and that's a world of difference. Make sure to separate your style, state, widgets. It's kind of it's same thing in web development or wherever you're at, separating things, separation that matters. Yeah, and check for plugins. There's hundreds, thousands of plugins. You can get a whole login page for free with just one of the plugins that I've used in the past, and I've really liked it. Yeah, and then build early on, like with the Parse SDK. I used to use a lot of Firebase, but now I use a lot of Parse, which is like Facebook's old database, back into the service, and I really like it a lot. But I found that like it had a bug. If you don't build early on for native, it doesn't build out certain dependencies, and then I don't know, it just never ran. Definitely recommend running builds early on your native devices. Yep, and then you have to modify the plist and the Android build scripts too, just like if you're doing native or capacitor. Cordova usually handles that for you, but in this you have to kind of go into the build scripts, the plist. So, and that's really it. I think there's a little bit more to the whole presentation, but you guys can go through and look at it some more. But it is a lot for the allotted time. So, yeah.